Trump's whipsawing tariff measures have created continual chaos in global markets and consternation in all the capitals of the world. To better understand what is happening and why, today we'll take a deep dive in this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we will be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country we are told to hate, but know so little about. I'm KJ No. These are this week's headlines. Vietnam signs 45 business deals with China. Hanoi has signed 45 new business deals with China during President Xi Jinping's official state visit to Vietnam, the first of his three-country tour of Southeast Asia. Highlighting the ongoing development of win-win security and economic cooperation, these deals are likely to include railway development, security cooperation, transportation, technology transfer, and preferential loans for Vietnam, and possibly the importation of Chinese commercial aircraft. Vietnam is China's greatest trading partner, with a total of $205 billion in cross-border commerce and a key supply chain partner. However, Vietnam was saddled with tariffs of 46%, currently paused for 90 days, but still one of the highest tariff rates of any country. The CPV and the CPC have strengthened inter-party ties, building on the legacy of the close support that China offered during the Vietnam War, when China sent over 2 million weapons, 15,000 vehicles, 500 tanks, along with 320,000 troops to support Vietnam's struggle against U.S. imperialism. China now officially has flying taxis. China's civil administration has now authorized the operation of pilotless electric flying taxis in two Chinese cities, Guangzhou and Hefei. This is the first approval of commercial autonomous air taxis in the world. The Civil Aviation Administration of China has granted air operator certificates to Yihang and Hefei Heyi Aviation, allowing the public to book flights for low-altitude tourism, urban sightseeing, and more. Yihang is paving the way for large-scale commercialization of autonomous aerial mobility, the company announced. Member of anti-China organization denied entry to China. British Member of Parliament Vera Hobhouse was denied entry into the Chinese city of Hong Kong. The state news outlet, the BBC, portrayed the denial of her entry as that of an innocent grandmother who was tragically prevented from cuddling her own grandchild. Authorities gave me no explanation for this cruel and upsetting blow, Ms. Hobhouse said, who also described herself as devastated. However, according to journalist Nuri Vitachi, the organization to which Hobhouse belongs, IPAC, is a CIA cutout focused on attacking and demonizing China, with deep ties to the NED and George Soros's Open Society Foundation. On its website, IPAC lists the NED and other regime change NGOs as partners. During the 2019-2020 Hong Kong riots, IPAC was an enabler of the violence that nearly destroyed the city and resulted in the burning of hundreds of businesses, thousands of violent assaults on citizens, the burning of one man, the killing of another, and the kidnapping and the torture of a journalist. MP Hobhouse follows a line of entitled MPs from the constituency of Bath who have sought to undermine Hong Kong and deliver cruel and upsetting blows to the Chinese people. The last MP from Bath who entered Hong Kong was the Tory factotum, Chris Patten. Patten, who had failed to win even 22,000 votes in his own constituency in Bath, was appointed as a consolation prize the governorship of Hong Kong, becoming the de facto colonial dictator of over 6 million people in 1992. During his reign as Hong Kong's colonial dictator, not once did Patton ever put his office or his policies to a vote, ruling instead by fiat. However, once he left his office, he ardently demanded total democratization. China identifies natural compound to enable safer, more efficient cancer treatments. A research team from Tianjin University has decoded one of the mechanisms that fuel cancer and identified a natural compound derived from traditional Chinese medicine to inhibit liver cancer growth. Lactate functions as a metabolic fuel for cancer cells, and disrupting lactate transport is being researched as a promising intervention in cancer treatment. Chinese researchers identified psilocybin, a natural compound derived from TCM's daji, as a potential blocker of the monocarboxylate transporter that moves lactate in the body. Lab trials have confirmed the efficacy of this approach in cell and animal culture, which suggests that this has the potential to generate newer and safer treatments for cancer. The identification of psilocybin as a potential treatment echoes the work of other Chinese scientists who have mined the classical Chinese pharmacopoeia for healing compounds, such as artemisinin for malaria and huangqi as a bicaline source effective for COVID symptoms. Trump's tariff measures have been giving consumers, businesses, and pundits whiplash. In the 2 days following Trump's tariff declaration, stock markets lost $10 trillion, then recovered, then fell again, and then were followed by bond markets, which also declined rapidly. Trump has deferred tariffs on all countries now, except for China, for 90 days, while carving out an exception for Chinese electronic goods, but also signaling that this was only a temporary reprieve. Top hedge fund managers have said a recession is almost certain because of these measures. What are the economic and geopolitical considerations behind these capricious actions? What are their impacts? We've asked Ben Norton to join us today to do a deep dive into what is really going on. Ben is the editor of Geopolitical Economic Report and a highly sought after analyst of all things China related. Welcome back, Ben.
Thanks for that much too generous introduction. It's always a pleasure being here.
Thank you, Ben. Well, Ben, let's just jump straight into it. I mean, I think everybody is completely befuddled, including people who are considered to be experts. But this doesn't seem to be making any sense. This constantly whipsawing approach to the economy and to tariffs. Trump imposed tariffs on the world, including on the penguins on McDonald Island. And then in the wake of market crashes, he stayed the tariffs for 90 days and then removed electronics. And it's just back and forth. And, you know, the kindest way to describe this is, to me, it looks like my dog is trying to do a Rubik's Cube. It's not making any progress. It's just going to destroy everything. But on again, off again tariff war. What's going on here? Is there any logic to this? Is there any method to this madness?
Very good question. I mean, everyone is asking that question. I think only Trump knows the answer. I personally think that there definitely is incompetence and there definitely is ignorance. But I also think that this is part of Trump's strategy. Trump sees himself as a deal maker. He constantly boasts about this. I think the way that he sees the situation is he's trying to scare the rest of the world, and in particular, a few countries like China. He thinks the U.S. has all of this leverage. Trump gave a very arrogant speech at this Republican gala in which he boasted that other countries are coming to him and kissing his butt, as he said. I mean, he's just so arrogant about all of this. And I think part of this strategy, again, is he's he has his own spokespeople and cabinet members who are issuing contradictory statements. So Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, goes out and says something completely different. Trump contradicts him on his social media website, his Twitter copy. And then the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, goes out and says something different. And then his economic advisor, Peter Navarro, says something different. So there's all these contradictions. Part of that is because it's really Trump who's making all of these decisions, and the others are simply just trying to do what they're told. But again, I think Trump sees himself as this grand deal maker, and he wants to scare everyone. He's copying this idea going back to Richard Nixon of the Mad Men strategy. And, I'm not trying to say that Trump is doing 4D chess and is a genius. I don't think that's true at all. I actually think he's a very ignorant and frankly stupid man. But I do think that this part of this, chaos is part of his attempt to pressure China in particular. And I don't think it's going to work. I think Trump is vastly overstating the cards that the U.S. holds. This is the language that Scott Bessent used. Scott Bessent is, of course, a billionaire hedge fund manager who's now the Secretary of the Treasury. And he went on TV and he said, China doesn't have any cards. We have all the cards because China relies on exporting to the United States. Howard Lutnick, another billionaire who's Trump's Commerce Secretary, he went on Fox News and said the same thing. He said, China is much more dependent on us than we are dependent on China, which is ridiculous. It's actually the exact opposite. And the fact that Trump issued these exceptions for Chinese electronics is actually an implicit admission that the U.S. is very dependent on trade with China. Because if you look, even this has been so contradictory, everyone's confused. So Trump issued an executive order that announced an exception for the tariffs on Chinese phones, computers, semiconductors, and other electronics. Now, this is very funny because what are China's largest exports to the U.S.? Phones, computers, batteries, and other electronics. They represent around 40% of Chinese exports to the U.S. in terms of overall value, in terms of dollar value. So Trump says he wants to put 145% tariffs on China and cut off trade with China. And yet he's putting exceptions on the most important products that China exports to the U.S. because he knows at the end of the day, the U.S. cannot produce those products locally, these important technologies locally. If he really does believe that the U.S. will do so, that it will reindustrialize, it's going to take many years, if not decades, to actually produce those goods in the U.S., to create new supply chains located in the U.S. by excluding China. This is a process that's going to take a very long time. And so Trump issued this executive order that calls for exceptions on those Chinese goods. And then he posted a message on his social media platform saying that actually there is no exception. But then he revealed that actually there is an exception, but it's not 145% tariffs on Chinese electronics. It's 20% tariffs. So regardless, every single day the news changes. But I think the important thing to take away from this is that, one, the U.S. is much more reliant on China than it wants the world to think. And China recognizes that, which is why Trump issued these exemptions. And it's why China has not budged. Trump keeps saying, I want Xi to call me. President Xi needs to call me. He's not going to do that. He expects that China is going to bend over backward to meet the U.S. and all these demands. But actually, we see that China is holding all the cards. So that's the most important message to take away. And the other message is that, again, I don't think this is all some kind of 4D chess and Trump's a genius. I think he is fine with the chaos and he wants to scare other countries. But at the end of the day, this is just going to blow back on the United States. It's already going to blow back, as you mentioned, that most mainstream economists and big banks in Wall Street are already predicting very high chances of a recession in the U.S. But it's also going to blow back because Trump says he wants all of these foreign companies to invest in the United States. But there's so much insecurity and so much chaos that they can't even make decisions to invest in the United States because they don't know if these tariffs will exist even next week, yet alone in a few years. So Trump says he wants the tariffs to be used as leverage to attract foreign investments and reindustrialize, but actually he's just paralyzing investors. He's paralyzing the companies that he serves. And at the end of the day, I think he's doing much more damage to the US economy than even the other economies that he's also trying to damage.
Ben, I have to agree with you that he's doing more damage to the US economy. I mean, this reminds me, I was looking out of my apartment one day. There's a homeless person who lives in front of my apartment across the street. And one day he was, screaming. And I realized that he was grabbing himself, grabbing the collar of his shirt and then punching himself in the face. It's like, mime, performance art. But essentially, he was hurting himself. And this gives that impression that they really don't understand the economy, that they're working on some kind of flat earth theory of the economy, that, current account deficits or trade balance is the measure of national strength and not, for example, GDP. And also, really, as you point out, that China is more dependent than the U.S. is on China. I mean, you and I have both seen the article in Foreign Affairs where they say that what China gets from the United States is money, which is fungible, whereas what the United States gets from China are intermediary or finished goods, which are not easily substitutable. So can you say a little bit more about why and how the US is more dependent on China than vice versa?
Yeah, this is such an important point. Now, if you listen to the rhetoric of the Trump administration, as you said, I think it's accurate to compare it to flat earthers, because Trump thinks that having a trade deficit means other countries are robbing the US. I won't even say the words that he said in his April 2nd speech. They were crazy, like violating the US. And this is insane. So I mean, I am one of the biggest critics of the current financial system as it exists. I think we need a new financial system, but the US is the one that benefits from this financial system. And the US created this financial system in order to benefit itself. The US prints dollars, which these days, the vast majority of dollars in the world are not even physical. They don't even need to be printed. It makes more dollars by adding zeros on a computer screen. I mean, that's what the US does. And then it uses those dollars to buy goods that are produced by workers in China, workers in Vietnam and South Korea and many countries that have export-oriented economies. So these Vietnamese and Chinese workers that now face very high tariffs, well, they were suspended temporarily on Vietnam, but these Chinese workers, they, work very hard to make these products. China exports them. The U.S. pays China. Well, U.S. importers pay Chinese companies in dollars, and then China gets access to all these dollars. And historically, it would invest them in U.S. government debt, U.S. Treasury securities, but it knows that those are no longer reliable, especially after the U.S. and the European Union seized hundreds of billions of dollars of US and EU bonds of asset government debt. So China has been, over the past decade, has been de-dollarizing its reserves. But the point is that the US created this system that gave it what's known as the exorbitant privilege of having the global reserve currency and simply printing dollars, adding zeros on a computer screen, and then getting all of these goods that are produced by people around the world. Obviously, this is a horrible system, and I think we need a different system. But Trump is not trying to create a new system. Trump has said many times that he likes the current system, and he wants to save the dollar's hegemony, and he's threatened 100% tariffs on any country that tries to de-dollarize. He's threatened BRICS. He claimed that he killed BRICS, which is not true. And Trump's top economic advisor gave a speech this April. His name is Stephen Myron, in which he articulated the Trump administration's strategy of using tariffs as blackmail to force other countries to pay tribute to the United States, to the U.S. empire, in order to maintain this system. They complain that it's expensive for the U.S. to maintain its hundreds of foreign military bases and this financial system. So they want other countries to pay tribute. As Stephen Myron, Trump's top economic advisor, said, they want other countries to write checks to the U.S. Treasury. That's what he said, to subsidize the U.S. empire. So this system is already biased in the interest of the U.S. Trump wants to make it even more egregiously biased in the interest of the U.S. and he wants to end trade deficits, which, by the way, is totally contradictory because in order to maintain the dollar as the global reserve currency, other countries have to get dollars in order to use dollars in international trade. So Trump says that he's going to put 100% tariffs on countries or like in BRICS or other countries that de-dollarize. But he also says that he wants to end trade deficits with other countries. So how are they going to get the dollars that they need to use the dollar in international trade and to hold dollars in their reserves? It's a completely contradictory policy. But at the end of the day, Trump he's acting like a mafia don. He wants the entire world to pay him protection money as part of an extortion racket. And this gets us to China. So obviously the system is not really benefiting China. China has been trying to create a new financial system that is more equitable, but China also understands that this cannot be done overnight. This is part of a process going on many years or even decades. And China's strategy for decades, but especially since 1978 and the beginning of the reform and opening up under the leader Deng Xiaoping, the idea was that China would maintain a low profile and would play the game slow and steady wins the race. They would keep their heads low. They would develop. They would not poke the bear, the U.S. being the bear in this case. They would not try to provoke imperialists' attack on them so they could develop and focus on lifting people out of poverty. And that's China's approach. They don't want to just overnight turn over the apple cart, destroy everything, and create a new financial system. They've been working over many years now on trying to create new institutions. They're, of course, a key part of BRICS. They have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative. There are so many different institutions and projects. But now Trump is essentially saying, we're just going to blow up this system that we created, that the U.S. benefited from, to try to make a system that is even more explicitly pro-U.S., that is even more blatantly imperialist. Previously, the U.S. tried to maintain this kind of unofficial empire, and Trump just wants a full-on 19th century empire. Trump is a man of the 19th century. He loves McKinley. He wants to go back to the era of the robber barons. He constantly talks about how these tariffs were great in the 19th century. And every U.S. president is imperialist, including Democrats, not just Republicans. But Trump's imperialism is especially blatant. It's openly colonial. He wants to colonize Greenland. He wants to colonize Gaza, the Panama Canal, talking about colonizing Canada. And getting back to this issue of U.S. trade with China, he thinks that he can use the large U.S. economy. It is large. It's not the largest in the world. China's is when you measure it purchasing power parity and has been since 2016. But the U.S. economy is large. A lot of that's because the U.S. dollar is overvalued. And if the dollar ended its status as the global reserve currency, the U.S. economy would actually be seen as much smaller than it actually is if other currencies appreciated against the dollar. But the point is that the U.S. has some leverage, but it's not nearly as much as Trump thinks it is. What does China export to the U.S.? I already mentioned that over 1/3 of China's exports to the U.S. are electronics. The top exports are phones, computers, and electric batteries, and many other things, car parts, many things. And then, of course, China also exports textiles, plastic products. So apparently Trump, when he says he wants to reindustrialize, he's not going to reindustrialize making electronics, which he's actually put exemptions on. He's going to reindustrializing making sneakers and T-shirts and plastic and Tupperware in the U.S. Are those the good manufacturing jobs he wants to bring back? Anyway, now what does the U.S. export to China? He thinks that the U.S. is so dependent on, he thinks that China is so dependent on the U.S. and can't replace the U.S. Okay, the top U.S. exports to China are oil and gas, soybeans, both of those are easily replaceable, and advanced semiconductors. Now, there are a lot of countries that make oil and gas. China can and is buying from them. There are a lot of countries that export soybeans, like, for instance, Brazil, which has become a more and more important trading partner with China as a member of BRICS. It is true that semiconductors, advanced semiconductors, chips, which China historically was dependent on, the U.S. did have a significant advantage in the most advanced semiconductors, especially from NVIDIA, which is a U.S. company. However, the Biden administration put export restrictions on China to try to block China from getting access to the most cutting-edge chips. to try to sabotage China's AI industry. So what has China done for the past several years? It has been pouring resources into developing its own domestic chip ecosystem, so it's no longer dependent on US exports of high-end chips. And by the way, you know what other region of the world is a leading producer of chips is Taiwan province. And now Trump is trying to force Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company to move to the United States and preparing for a potential war on the Chinese mainland. But China, in the meantime, the mainland has been developing its own indigenous advanced semiconductors. So China has been preparing for years these kinds of economic attacks and becoming more independent and sovereign technologically and self-sufficient. So Trump thinks he has all these cards, but you keep looking. Every time he says something, China's already thought of this and has been preparing for years. Another example is Trump keeps saying, people in the Trump administration keep saying, China is so dependent on exporting to the US. Now, it is true that that China does export a lot to the US, but it's no longer the largest market for China's exports. ASEAN is now the largest trading partner of China. And if you look at China's exports to ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and its exports to the US, they've fallen substantially going to the US in the past few years, and they've risen going to ASEAN and many other countries. So the US thinks that it's completely irreplaceable, but all Trump is doing he's accelerating this process that China has been carrying out, as I mentioned, slowly as part of this. This is the Chinese modus operandi, which is to move slowly, to keep your head low, not to rock the boat, but to, like the tail of the tortoise, slow and steady wins the race. Whereas you have this US maniac government that's just out of control, attacking everyone, threatening their allies. No one trusts them. And that's very quickly, that fuse is going to end. It's going to blow up in their face. And China's approach, this slow and steady approach, it's now being accelerated because of Trump's attacks. But China's been already prepared, and it's looking very strongly like China will come out much better than the US will.
I have to agree with you, Ben. I think that China is going from strength to strength. I believe that it has been preparing for these tariffs since the last Trump administration. And of course, as you point out, China not only has cards to play, it probably made the cards, as many people are saying. So the other thing is, just to kind of add to what you said, China's exports to the United States are about 3% of GDP. Is that correct?
Yeah, and falling.
And falling, right. And 3% of GDP it's not great, but it's not a deal breaker. I mean, the city of Shanghai contributes more to China's GDP than everything that China exports to the United States. And Nassim Taleb has pointed out, for every dollar that China loses in this tariff war, the US will lose 7. So certainly we can see that, the advantage is on China. But I want to go back to this idea that, there is this belief that the US, through tariffs, can actually reshore production back to the United States. We have a clip from Peter Navarro where he explicitly says that. Let's watch that clip.
We've had a beautiful turnaround in the financial markets, the bond markets, and we're going to move forward and get the best deals we can for the American people. The ultimate goal, Lindsay, is to return manufacturing, not just assembly, but manufacturing back to U.S. soil. And that's what's Make America Great Again is all about.
So, I mean, that is a kind of an astounding statement on many, many levels. I mean, we know that deindustrialization is a process that happened over 5 decades. And in China's case, it took decades for them to industrialize. But this notion that they can simply turn on a dime and reindustrialize seems far-fetched. There's also another clip I want to show you. This is a person who does his manufacture in China, and he explains why this is not possible for him.
With a whole bunch of kicking and screaming, I can get an American company to make this for maybe $1,200, not powder coated, no packaging, no shipping, and I get this for like $250 in China. And then China says, like, how many do you want? You want 5 pieces? You want 100? You want 500? We don't care. And then the biggest thing I'm running into with American companies is that they're coming back and they're just saying, like, well, how are we supposed to make this? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I gave you CAD designs. Like, look at the CAD designs. And they're like, but we don't know if, you know, you're not telling us if we should weld this corner on here. And then they're sending me back these pictures of, like, the thing kind of taken apart. And they're like, you need to tell us, like, that you want this corner welded here and then that you want this piece bent and what. And I'm like, I'm not a metal shop, man. We're a software development company. Like, I give this to China and they say no problem. And then 6 weeks later, I have these beautiful boxes in my hands for 1/10 of the price of America. And so even if the tariffs end up being the original 25% tariff plus the 10% that he just added, plus another 25% on steel products, I'm probably still going to make them in China because I don't have to deal with Americans. And on top of all that, like, you know, you add another 60% to what I'm paying, I bet they're still cheaper to do in China with 1,000,000 times less headache. Like, I hate working with American companies so much. There are no words for me to describe how horrible of an experience it is working with American companies, especially in the steel industry. So,
Ben, your comments.
Well, a few things. Just thinking about the math there, if I remember correctly, he said that he buys it from China for 200, and if he did it in the US, it would be over 1,000, right? Is that what he said?
1,200 according to him.
So Trump would have to put on over 500% tariffs for that to still be, for him to buy it locally. I mean, it still makes sense for him to buy it from China despite 500% tariffs. What this shows is that tariffs alone do not reindustrialize countries or industrialize countries. If all you need to do is to put tariffs on to industrialize, then every country in the world would have sky-high tariffs. It's not that simple. Now, you know, I've made it very clear for many years now, and I make it clear in my show, I'm not a free trade supporter at all. I'm very critical of this whole idea of free trade. And I'm not against tariffs in principle, but tariffs have to be very specific, strategic, and isolated. The use of blanket tariffs like this by Trump is so stupid, and all it's going to do is result in higher prices in the US and a tax burden on poor and working class people, which I'll get to in a second. I think this is part of Trump's strategy. He wants to use blanket tariffs. He said this openly many times. He wants to use blanket tariffs to raise government revenue so he can reduce taxes on the rich and on corporations. So in other words, Trump is moving the burden of taxation off of capital and onto labor, off of the rich and onto the poor and working class. That's what tariffs are. They're a tax on consumption, and they are borne by the majority of the population who are working class people. Now, as for tariffs, when they could be positive and they could be used as part of a larger industrial policy to industrialize a country, to develop manufacturing sectors in strategic areas, every advanced economy, every industrialized economy has used an industrial policy, a basket of different policies led by the government in order to industrialize. This is true of the United States originally. This is true of European countries. This is true of Japan, South Korea, and of course, China. They all use state-led policies that include, and ironically, you know who invented industrial policy? It was the first Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in his famous report on manufacturers. He talked about how the U.S. government needed to invest in infrastructure. It needed to use a government bank in order to provide credit to industrialists. It needed to educate the population in order to work in these factories. And then every single industrial economy has followed this approach of having a state-led model of industrial development. In the case of China, it's the clearest, and it's been the most successful, and it's been the fastest. In just a few decades, China has gone from producing around 1 or 2% of global manufacturing output 40 years ago to now producing around 32% of global manufacturing output. As a mainstream Western economist put it in an article, a scholarly article last year, China is the world's only industrial superpower. But to be honest, it's not just China. Look at what South Korea did, despite the many problems with the right-wing military dictatorship and all of that. The government in South Korea said they had 5-year plans under Park Chung-hee, and they said, these are the 6 sectors we are going to industrialize. The government is going to control its access to foreign currency, restrict local South Korean workers from getting access to foreign currency. We're going to use this only to import capital goods and machinery, and we're going to industrialize our country through a state-led industrial campaign. Even Japan, which has been a one-party state since 1955, go back and look at Japan's industrial policy. This is how every country industrialized. You can't just rely on the free market and magically companies will invest and industrialize, because manufacturing is not that profitable when you're competing with the rest of the world. Your profit margins are pretty low. A lot of other countries can make toasters and even cars, right? There's many car companies around the world. So a lot of capitalists, it's not in their economic interest to simply create manufactured goods. This is why the US deindustrialized. It's much more profitable to speculate in the stock market. That's the most profitable of all. It's much more profitable to make a tech monopoly and then charge monopoly rents, and your profit margins are like 80%. So this is why the US is deindustrialized. It was not profitable for US capitalists to manufacture locally. Of course, they did want to exploit foreign workers. That was certainly part of it. But it's also simply because in the US, if you want to be a very wealthy oligarch, if you look at all of the billionaires, most of their wealth comes from either finance or big tech. And a lot of those big tech companies are basically financialized companies. So Trump has this idea that all you do is you just put tariffs on and magically capitalists will industrialize the country. It's not going to happen. All you're going to do is massively increase the costs of all of those imported goods, because they're still going to be expensive to produce locally. If Trump really wants to reindustrialize, and I've said for years that the US should reindustrialize, but the only possible way of doing it is doing the exact opposite of what Donald Trump is doing. The US government would have to, one, massively invest in infrastructure. Trump is cutting infrastructure spending. He's imposing austerity. The government would have to massively invest in education and worker training programs. The US doesn't have the skilled workers, as that business owner was talking about. They don't have the skilled workers to actually develop these, to manufacture these advanced goods. This is why the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, when they opened these factories in Arizona, because the Biden administration gave them billions of dollars to do so, they didn't have any local workers, so they sent over a bunch of Taiwanese workers with their family members to Arizona. Okay, so the US government would have to massively invest in education. Trump is in the process of abolishing the Department of Education. Furthermore, Trump would have to actually plan. The government would have to say, okay, we are targeting these sectors, these industries. We're going to develop a local semiconductor industry, and we're going to put tariffs on foreign semiconductors, not all foreign goods with this blanket tariffs, which all it does is raise prices. Specifically, we're going to develop a local semiconductor industry, and we're going to protect the local industry and then develop it. And then eventually you lift the tariffs and they can compete internationally. Otherwise, eventually they'll have to always live under these tariffs or they can't compete. So Trump is not using tariffs as part of an industrial policy. The only way, if you look at China, one of the reasons that Chinese manufacturers are also very competitive, it's not because of low wages. Wages in China have increased by tenfold in the past 30 years. The reason that one of many reasons that China is so competitive is because the Chinese government owns the electrical grid, the telecommunications infrastructure, all of the banks, the land, infrastructure, transportation. So China reduces the costs of production in all of those ways by providing very cheap electricity, very cheap transportation, very cheap access to infrastructure, very good infrastructure. They educate and train workers. And then the state-owned banks in China give very favorable loans to develop manufacturing. The Chinese government made a plan. Because they have a socialist government, and every 5 years, the Communist Party has a 5-year plan. And in addition to their 5-year plan, they have specific plans for industries. A few years ago, they announced a plan for what they call new energy vehicles, what we would call electric vehicles. And they said, by this year, we're going to develop this many electric vehicles, develop our electric vehicle industry, etc. And what happened? The government poured resources into developing an electric vehicle industry. And now China is the world leader in EVs. So do we think that Donald Trump is going to do any of that? Not in a million years. Donald Trump is not using tariffs as an industrial policy. He's not going to reindustrialize. It's fake. It's a myth. It's a talking point. He's using tariffs, one, to raise revenue so he can cut taxes further on the rich and on corporations, which is a regressive tax. It's removing a tax burden off of capital onto labor. He's using taxes too as a form of blackmail, as his economic advisor Stephen Myron said, to force other countries to pay the United States tribute for access to the U.S. market. He wants to pressure these countries that are occupied by the U.S., like South Korea and Japan, Germany. He's going to say, if you want our soldiers to stay there, you need to pay us money. You need to reduce your trade surplus with us. You have to buy more goods from the U.S. He's using tariffs for political reasons to pressure other countries to go along with what he wants, but he's not going to reindustrialize. There's no way it's going to happen. I'll go out on a limb here. I'm going to bet that the U.S. trade deficit will increase despite the tariffs, because not only is it going to be very hard for the U.S. to reindustrialize because of everything I just mentioned, but it's going to be even more difficult because the U.S. has to import all of these intermediate goods in order to develop the factories and the technologies that they need. Because the U.S., if they want to reindustrialize, they have to make all of these factories, they have to create all of this equipment, all of these machines, but they don't even make the screws and the gears and all of the parts, as that guy was just explaining, for the machine. So let's say the U.S. wants to create cell phones in the U.S. Well, the U.S. is going to have to import all of the machine tools, which China makes, to make those phones. The U.S. is going to have to import all of the semiconductor machines that are used for the lower level semiconductors, because the U.S. is a world leader in very advanced semiconductors, in designing them, but not in manufacturing them, and certainly not in manufacturing what are known as the legacy chips locally. China, mainland China, actually is the world's leader in what are known as legacy chips, which is not the most advanced, 7 nanometer and smaller chips, but the average chips that are in most, low cost electronics. The U.S. would have to import all of the intermediate goods in order to develop that locally. So the U.S. trade deficit would increase. So, everything Trump is doing is just, honestly, I do think at the end of the day that it's not simple enough to say that it's simply idiotic, that the only reason this is happening is Trump is stupid. But I do think that's part of it. I think actually one of the factors is that Trump hasn't studied history. He's surrounded by people who have never studied history. Their understanding of the world is from Fox News and Twitter, and they don't understand what it would actually take to industrialize the United States. It would take basically a socialist revolution to reindustrialize the US.
There's an interesting video which is making the rounds, which a Chinese TikToker addresses the US directly, and he says, you don't need tariffs. What you need is a revolution. During this period of exchange, we took, and trade is, as much as possible, both parties look to exchange equivalents. And he's saying that, during this period of industrialization, we gained wealth And then we took all this wealth and we turned it into public wealth. And, our lives are better. And in the meantime, everything that was acquired on your part in terms of your super profits was siphoned straight up to the top, and they bought yachts and mansions with swimming pools, and you are left with nothing except drug addiction, and no health insurance. And so I think this is a very, very real and accurate analysis. But I want to come back to this notion of industrialization and financialization. As you point out, the intermediate goods, if they wanted to reindustrialize, would also have to be imported from China. And of course, we know that Trump himself doesn't really have any experience in manufacture. I believe, a person's background influences their worldview. Trump is a person who worked primarily in real estate. His family were slumlords. If you're gaining or if you're, collecting rent, there is no supply chain when it comes to, rent. And there is no supply chain when it comes to established real estate or buildings. That doesn't require supply chain. But manufacturing actually does require a real and considerable supply chain. And I think that Trump, having come out of the financial class, doesn't understand how complex it is to do industrial development. And at the same time, the United States itself is in the monopoly stage of capital, which is to say that, as Peter Thiel says, competition is for losers. These are large corporations. They don't want competition. They don't want markets. They simply want monopoly rents. And you can see this, if you look at GM, GM makes cars, but largely it's shifting to selling loans. Same thing with Amazon. You log on to Amazon, immediately you'll get an offer from Amazon if you want to take out a loan to buy what you need, which is what happens under monopoly capitalism, because the workers are so immiserated they can no longer afford the goods that are being produced. I mean, even if you want to buy a burrito, there's an app where you can log on, order your burrito, and then you can pay for it in 5 easy installments. And so this continual financialization of the economy points out that, this is already a done deal. We cannot, turn back the tide. So in this context, as you point out, the idea is to, raise revenue to offset tax cuts. They're using it as a negotiating tactic to, quote unquote, get better trade deals. They claim that they're going to reduce consumer prices, but I don't think that's going to happen. It's actually going to be the opposite. They're certainly not going to be able to reshore industry, certainly not to the extent that they want. And then, of course, I think underneath this all is this idea that they're going to somehow contain and beat China. And I think that is a large part of the underlying strategy. I want to show you this little clip from Peter Thiel and get your comments on it.
They're talking about now seems where we're going, where you need a very drastic reset with China. In theory, you need a reset with other people, but what we really need to get them to do is also reset things with China. I think the rough numbers are that about a quarter of the U.S. trade deficit is bilaterally with China, but another quarter is indirectly with China. So China is sort of half the problem, and so it's selling components that then get reassembled elsewhere, and then China is the geopolitical rival. So there's a way in which if people in Mercedes in Germany are selling cars to the U.S., we might want to have those pretty well-paying jobs in the U.S. and not in Germany. And there are all kinds of sort of mercantilist policies that at the margins Germany engages in. But it's probably not going to repurpose the Mercedes factory to build tanks to invade the U.S. or something like this. Yeah. Whereas this this sort of dual use problem is the problem with China. And so there are ways the economic relationship with China is fairly efficient. If people working for $1.50 an hour in a Foxconn factory, we don't really want to get those jobs in Wisconsin. But it is this geopolitical rivalry where that's in the background, where that you have to somehow factor in, that the economists never are able to factor in properly with China. And so I think, yeah, the I don't know, I'm not sure I would call this the optimistic plan, but the reset in trade that seems desirable to me would be that we radically change the relationship with China, and we sort of induce a lot of other countries to radically change their relationship with China, and that's how we, and maybe that's how we build a stronger Western alliance of the free world.
So Ben, your comments. Mercedes-Benz is not going to invade the United States, but the inference there being that China is. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so many things. Like claiming that, he said the quote is that Mercedes-Benz is not making tanks to invade the US, but then China could make tanks to invade the US. That's so crazy. China has not been involved in a war since 1979. That's ridiculous. China's not planning on invading the US. So many other things he said, like this honestly racist stereotype that all Chinese workers are making $1 an hour in a Foxconn factory is completely absurd. I mean, it was already grossly exaggerated from the first place decades ago, but today, I mean, manufacturing wages in China have skyrocketed, and today they're higher than any other country surrounding China in Southeast Asia, higher than the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. Vietnam and China have had the fastest growing wages in the manufacturing sector. The only countries that they're higher in are in South Korea and Japan, but obviously they developed much earlier. And of course, they were not under attack by the US. They were close US allies. They were allowed to engage in these kind of developmentalist policies that China was not allowed to for much of its revolutionary history. But anyway, so I mean, this idea from Peter Thiel and other people that all workers in Chinese factories are just like slaves getting paid nothing, it's absurd. It's completely ridiculous. It's actually it's copium. They don't want to acknowledge that the reason that China is so advanced in manufacturing is not because workers are paid little. They're actually paid very well, especially when you adjust for the purchasing power parity. When you look at the purchasing power of the Chinese currency, in yuan, you can see that workers in Chinese factories are probably making like maybe $40 an hour at equivalent, if you actually adjust for the purchasing power of the yuan. It's not $1. It's ridiculous. But they don't want to acknowledge that, because then they would have to acknowledge that the Chinese system is much better. It's objectively better when it comes to actually producing tangible goods that make people's lives better. That China can produce everything more efficiently at a lower cost and can simply outcompete US monopoly corporations that don't want competition, because as Peter Thiel himself admitted in an article in the Wall Street Journal, as he said, quote, "Competition is for losers," end quote. He argued in defense of monopolies. He said monopolies are good, and he boasted that the business model of Silicon Valley is establishing monopolies, because when you have monopolies, you can charge monopoly rents. You don't have any competitors pushing down your profit margins. Now, as for his talking point that attacking China can unite the West, he said it clearly. It's not just economic, as he put it. It's geopolitical, and he also framed it in a kind of cultural way. I mean, Peter Thiel is a far-right fascistic figure. He is deeply authoritarian. He basically, I mean, he has written openly against liberal democracy. And, people on the left, socialists, are also very critical of bourgeois capitalist democracy. The idea that democracy, in scare quotes, means that every 4 years you have an election where you choose between one billionaire-backed candidate or another billionaire-backed candidate, and they both, back Israel's crimes against humanity and bomb Yemen. And that's obviously not democracy. That's ridiculous. But he has a far-right critique of liberal democracy, which is basically, we need a kind of Caesar figure. We need a kind of Hitlerian figure. This is how Peter Thiel sees the world. And let's not forget that U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance worked for Peter Thiel. He was basically created in a political petri dish by Thiel. Thiel funded J.D. Vance's 2022 Senate campaign in Ohio, he gave him more than $15 million for his campaign. That's the main reason that he won that campaign. And J.D. Vance is really the link between the Trump White House and Silicon Valley, the direct link, because Vance is friends with all of those oligarchs. He worked in Silicon Valley. He worked for Peter Thiel. He portrays himself as, like a populist who supports the working class. He worked in venture capital. Peter Thiel also now is rebranding himself as a great manufacturer. He's a venture capitalist. Look at the companies that Peter Thiel has invested in as an early seed investor. They're not manufacturing goods. The only manufacturing companies, in scare quotes, that only major ones that Peter Thiel has invested in are in the military industrial complex. Palmer Luckey and all of those also far-right Silicon Valley guys, that's the only actual manufacturing they do, is manufacturing of weapons to prepare for war on China. And what unites all of them, Thiel, Palmer Luckey, all these Silicon Valley freaks, is that they see China as the big threat to Western Christian civilization, white civilization. It's not just that they see China as a threat to their corporate interests, as these monopoly capitalists who openly say that monopolies are good and they don't want Chinese competition. It's not just that. It's also they see China as a threat to white civilization, Christian civilization, which they see as superior. They say that. Read Peter Thiel's books. Listen to when he talks about Western civilization. They are supremacists. They think the West is superior, and they see China as non-white, Asian, atheist, and communist. For them, it's everything they fear, and the far right in the U.S. has been preparing for years for this apocalyptic war on China to try to save white Western capitalism. For them, it's all part of the same combination. Of course, they're capitalists. Of course, they're following their economic interest, but it's even deeper than that. And this is why you listen to what he says, and he says, yeah, it's economic, but it's actually much deeper.
Yeah, and I think that, we should do an entire show on that topic itself. And certainly I think that we are moving towards war. War is the wall defibrillator for the, corpulent capitalist corpse when it starts to fibrillate and have a heart attack. But I absolutely agree with you. I think that, the tech bro dirtbag class is certainly gearing up for a civilizational, cultural, and apocalyptic war on China. But we'll have to do that on another occasion. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you, and thanks to the team at Breakthrough. Keep up the great work. It's always a pleasure.
And finally, to balance out our show, we're happy to share with you a more upbeat final segment. This is the children's chorus from Xiamen No. 6 Public Middle School, who will sing in a cappella the song The Brightest Star in the Night Sky. The lyrics go, whenever I'm lost in the night, the brightest star in the night sky will light my way forward.
颗透明的心灵和会流泪的眼睛。给我再去相信的勇气，越过谎言去拥抱你。每当我找